Iawn, gobeithio bod ni'n mynd yn fyw. Hopefully we're going live. Noswaith dda I bawb, croeso. Welcome to the Commissioner in Conversation. Croeso I Sgwrs gyda'r Comisiynydd. So I'm here this evening with Dr. Richard Lewis. Richard is the Chief Constable of Dyfed-Powys Police, and if you're not sure who I am, I'm Dafydd Llywelyn, the Police and Crime Commissioner for the area. Felly croeso, Richard. Iawn, mae problemau technegol falle gyda ni. We've got some technical problems. I can't see Richard moving at the moment, so it's a blank screen. But perhaps if I try and explain the background to the Commissioner in Conversation, this is an opportunity for us to have a live broadcast so that people through the social media channels can interact with both myself as the Commissioner and Richard as the Chief Constable in Dyfed-Powys. I'm hoping post-Easter, in a few weeks' time, we'll be able to get to a position of having regular Commissioner in Conversation sessions, which will go live, and we'll try and get key stakeholders to engage as part of the forum, and hopefully those responsible for certain departments within Dyfed-Powys Police as well, interacting with me as the Commissioner. So it's an opportunity, again, as I said, through social media channels for people to interact. So fi'n gobeithio, mewn amser I ddod, fydd cyfle I ni cael sgwrsiau gyda gwahanol pobl. A dwi yn gobeithio fydd y technoleg yn gweithio, fydd Richard yn gallu dod nôl ato ni. So I do hope that the technology is able to bring Richard back from the Ethernet somewhere on the World Wide Web. Richard has been frozen out, so we're hoping to get him reconnected so that we can have a conversation. And I'll be asking Richard ultimately about sort of the motivations to come back to the force in Dyfed-Powys. What are his ambitions coming back to the force after being, as many of you will be aware, Richard has been the chief in Cleveland for a number of years. And what are the differences between the two forces, and I'll get into some conversation with Richard in relation to the future and the things that he wants to achieve here in Dyfed-Powys, and what perhaps are the pressures that he will face. Now, I've got a clear understanding, I guess, as the Commissioner, having been now the Commissioner for 6 years, of what some of those pressures are, but of course the nuanced relationship between the Commissioner and the Chief Constable is an interesting one, where although the strategic direction is through the Police and Crime Plan is delivered by myself as the Commissioner, ultimately the delivery of that then is with the Chief Constable, and it is his or her responsibility to deliver against those key priorities that are set out. And again, the financial pressures, I'm sure, will be something that will be touched upon. But it is interesting, if you look back over the last 5 years, that Dyfed-Powys Police has actually got a significant more investment and funding from the local council tax increases that have happened, as well as some central funding from central government. So hopefully Richard will be able to join me, and we'll get into the detail of some of that in a bit. So at the moment, I'm still seeing a black screen. And I've been hopefully keeping you entertained in relation to where we are with the Commissioner Conversation sessions. But of course, the whole purpose of this evening is to have somewhat of an insight into the first, I think now, the first 3 months ultimately of Richard arriving back in the force. I think it was the middle of December where he came back as the Chief Constable. And again, one of the privileges I have as being the Police and Crime Commissioner is that there's an opportunity for me to recruit and appoint the Chief Constable, and that is one of the significant roles that I play. But I don't do that in isolation on my own. It's something that we do in conjunction with, in effect, a panel of individuals, and I brought a panel of people, key stakeholders, to the table to go through an interview process for Richard to come back into the force. And Richard actually is the 4th Chief Constable that I have worked with as a Commissioner. If you recall, Simon Prince was the Chief when I arrived in 2016, but he had already made the decision to retire that year. I then appointed Mark Collins as the Chief Constable. And then for the last 12 months, we've had a temporary Chief Constable in Claire Parment, and I'm very grateful. And it's worthwhile me making a statement that I'm grateful for Claire and the work that she undertook for nearly a 12-month period in that role on a temporary basis. And then the tail end of last year, I appointed Richard into the role. And of course, it takes a little bit of time for a period of notice to be worked from Cleveland for Richard to arrive. So that is where we are in relation to the Chief Constable position. And I'm looking forward for the next few years to working with Richard. And I think he's already been making his mark with a few, some might say, controversial statements in relation to policing in Wales. And we'll hopefully get an opportunity to unpick some of those issues with Richard. So Richard, well, ar y gair.
You will see controversial, and I assume that you're speaking about the recent article.
I was, and I wasn't going to start with that. And in fact, I'm not going to start with that. We'll have that as a little tease for people, a little taster for people to sort of come on to in a little bit. So apologies for the technology. Something went awry. But croeso, that's what I was saying. Croeso I Sgwrs gyda'r Comisiynydd. Welcome to the Commissioning Conversation. I was explaining to people that you were the fourth Chief Constable, in essence, that I've worked with in the role of the Commissioner. And one of the privileges I have is to appoint the Chief Constable. So the first question from me is, what motivated you in applying to come back to Dyfed-Powys Police? Because we're aware that you worked in the force for a number of years before going to Cleveland as the Chief, and then you came back. So why come back, Richard?
Well, you've noted, of course, that I was a Chief Constable already working in Cleveland Police. So the motivation wasn't to be a Chief Constable. I'd already achieved that aim. The sole reason for me was to come home. I am a proud Welshman. I enjoyed every single minute of my time in Cleveland. It was an extraordinary time and an extraordinary privilege to lead a force in the northeast of England. But when the job was advertised, it was something that I felt compelled to do. I'd spent 19 years working at Dyfed-Powys and enjoyed every single second of that time as well. But when the job was advertised, it felt like a call to come home. And to be back amongst these communities that I know so well. Of course, as you will know, Commissioner, I was raised in Carmarthenshire, played rugby for a team in Pembrokeshire, raised a family in Ceredigion, and socialised extensively at the Royal Welsh Show and the Hay Festival in Powys. So all four counties are counties that I know really well. It's an extraordinary privilege to simply work at Dyfed-Powys Police, whether that is in a particular rank, grade, or as a volunteer. And I'm one of over 2,000 people working in this phenomenal place. And so just coming back in any guise, frankly, is an honour.
So on that point then, Richard, do you think it's important for the Chief Constable of Dyfed-Powys, because this will be different to your experience in Cleveland, to be an individual that understands the force in its communities and the communities that it serves as a force? Do you think that's important?
I'm glad you said that, because when you started the question, I thought you were going to ask me whether it was important to be from the Dyfed-Powys area. My answer to that would have been, no, it's not important to be from the Dyfed-Powys area. The point that you made is the correct one, I think, to understand our communities. Now, I have a natural head start, of course, in that regard, coming back to the force, because I like to think I do have an understanding of the communities, its history, the challenges that we've had, and the successes of the organisation as well. So deep understanding of the communities is vital to any public sector role, I think. And so it's a vital part of the work that we do, because we talk internally, don't we, about some processes, systems, initiatives that we might think about. And if it's an area that you don't know particularly well, every idea can seem like a good one. But being from the area and understanding it in the way that I know you do as well, you can almost attune to the public as to whether they think this idea that has been brought up by somebody in the force, or externally for that matter, is going to work or not. So an understanding of the communities is vital. And if I can add to that as well, an understanding of the workforce.
Indeed. So one of the things that I'm finding a bit peculiar about this evening's conversation is that we're both first language Welsh speakers. Mae'r ddoi yn ni'n siarad Cymraeg, a wrth gwrs, fe allan ni gynnal y sgwrs ma'n y Gymraeg. We could hold this conversation through the medium of Welsh. So what we are going to do is, at a point in time in the conversation, we'll turn to Welsh, and I think we'll probably have the last portion of the conversation through the medium of Welsh, just to give people a heads up that will happen a bit later on. But that links back again. You said you're a passionate Welshman. So how did the passionate Welshman go down in Cleveland? What were the challenges in Cleveland for you? Because obviously you were from outside of the force coming in, probably a bit different to what we're experiencing in Dyfed-Powys.
Yes, I mean, I suppose the diplomatic response is to say you'd have to ask the people of Cleveland what they thought of the Chief Constable they had up until just before Christmas. But in terms of the welcome, it couldn't have been any warmer. And I think there's an implicit link between the people in the north of England with us Welsh folk as well. To an extent, we both feel marginalised in the United Kingdom just through geography more than anything else. And so there was a natural affiliation I felt with the people there. There were Welsh speakers there as well, believe it or not, and plenty of Welsh people. I met a doctor in the local hospital out on an exercise one evening, the headmaster of the school in the town where I lived, and a Welsh speaker working within one of the teams at Cleveland Peace as well. So we get about us Welsh people, Welsh speakers and otherwise. So the welcome couldn't have been any warmer. But of course, the challenges at Cleveland are significantly different to those that are at Dyfed-Powys. And whilst ultimately it will be you and perhaps more importantly, the community that will decide whether my tenure here at Dyfed-Powys will be a successful one. But I think that time away in Cleveland, I hope, will have made me a better Chief Constable, having worked somewhere else as well and experienced a different demand profile.
So that demand profile you experienced, which was different in Cleveland, in what way was it different then? What was it? Was it the volume of crime? Because Cleveland is a relatively small area, isn't it? So was it the volume of crime or the type of crime that was being dealt with by the force? What are the main differences?
So those that are familiar with the geography of Dyfed-Powys, Cleveland fits into about a half of the size of Carmarthenshire. It is a tiny geographic location, but has more of a population than the whole of Dyfed-Powys, close to 600,000 people. So it is a county force, but with metropolitan problems, highly urbanised, phenomenal communities, a diverse community, and the crime profile there, well, the highest crime rate in England and Wales. That's not something we were proud of, and we work very closely with our communities to try and drive that down. Level of violence and all sorts of other problems that they've got. But wedded to that, the most wonderful communities, a phenomenal workforce who understood the challenges really well, and a group of people who I was in awe of that have worked there their whole careers and understood those challenges. So very different profile to Dyfed-Powys, as you know, statistically one of the safest places to live in England and Wales, and we're fortunate that it is that, of course. Hundreds of miles of coastline, geographically the biggest in England and Wales. And so we have a different set of challenges here at Dyfed-Powys to those that we had at Cleveland. So had I started my career and worked that first 19, 20 years at Cleveland and come here, I'm not sure how I'd have coped, because there are challenges we face at Dyfed-Powys that other forces don't. And those relate to geography, sparsity of the population. And so the 19 years that I spent here, first of all, I think clearly stood me, I hope, in good stead for returning.
So thinking ahead then, but again, in the context of having had the experiences of being a chief for 2 years, what were the main sort of things that you gained from that experience that you now think you can, what were the learning points that you now think can stand you in good stead for being the chief in Dyfed-Powys? Are there a few things that you would say, well, you've matured into the role?
Yes. Yeah, very much so. So what's made me, I hope a better Chief Constable is working at Cleveland means that you have to prioritise. There is more demand than there are people to do the work. And whilst the officers, staff and volunteers there are superhuman in the efforts that they produce day in, day out to keep communities safe, prioritisation is a must because, as I say, we had more demand than we had officers and staff to deal with it. And so working at Dyfed-Powys, because it's a safer place to live, as an organisation, the first 19 years that I spent here, you can almost do everything. So you can keep lots of pots simmering almost. And the temptation, therefore, is to try to do everything on day one brilliantly, rather than say, well, these are the priorities of the force. They're priorities because they appear in your police and crime plan, frankly, and with a mandate from the public. These are the things, as professional police officers and staff, we think we should also be looking at. So I think what Dyfed-Powys can do a better job of in the years to come, with the assistance of Deputy Chief Constable Claire Parmenter, ACC Emma Ackland, Edwin Harris, and all our phenomenal staff, is to say, what do we want to be brilliant at first? Let's solve those things which matter most to our communities and then go thereafter. So the thing perhaps more than anything I've learned at Cleveland is the art of prioritisation and the importance of that, and then sticking to those priorities relentlessly.
So that's interesting to hear, because having been associated with the force on a personal level, having worked within the force and been the commissioner now for a period of time, which spans actually 20 years, which is something I'm quite proud of. Are you therefore saying that in the past, I guess we've tried to be I guess, too responsive to dealing with everything, and the future holds that perhaps there are some elements we're going to prioritise above others, and therefore by default of saying that, there are some things that aren't going to be done. Is that how as a member of the public am I to interpret that, I guess? Yeah.
So I agreed with everything that you said up until the time you said, and things that won't be done. Demand comes in through the phone lines, we meet people in the street, of course, we get flagged down. So the way that we receive information and calls from the public happens in a number of different ways. What we can never do at Dyfed-Powys is to pick up the phone to some of those people and say, and I know you weren't suggesting this for 1 second, Dafydd, to say, yeah, that's not a priority for us, we can't be dealing with that today. But the art of prioritisation means that some things just aren't as important. That doesn't mean they don't get done. They will still need to get done. But the prioritisation of some aspects of our work, and one that you and I have talked about significantly over the last few weeks, has been visibility, making sure our public see that we are out and about, whether that's walking, whether that's online or other aspects, and other things such as domestic abuse in the crime world. So prioritising those first, but the message loud and clear to Dyfed-Powys as a community is, we will deal with all of your concerns because it's our job to do that. And potentially on occasions, we will signpost you to other agencies who are better set up to deal with your problems because it's within their remit.
So that's I think a good segue into some of the comments that have started coming in, which we're grateful for. And feel free, anybody who is interacting and listening to this conversation this evening, feel free to put the comments in the conversation bar for us to respond. I can't promise that we're going to respond to every single comment that's highlighted, but we'll try and weave some of them in. So when I go out and I engage with the community, very often the amount of drug dealing and perceived use of drugs within the community is one that is or has been for some time, but continues to be an issue for communities. Can you see or foresee that will maintain to be a priority for the force and something that will be tackled? What is the current operational response to that within our communities?
It's a sensitive matter for all our communities, and I'd encourage any members of our community watching tonight, submit information and intelligence to us. If you don't feel able to do that directly because of anonymity, etc., you can do so via 101, you can do so online as well. If you don't feel able to do that, you can do so anonymously with Crime Stoppers. So please do keep telling us about the problems in your communities, particularly if they're drugs, other things as well, of course. But in terms of that being a priority for the force, we set that control strategy getting on for about a month ago now, and illicit drugs is one of them. It's an enormous harm within our community. I think dealing in particular is something that we're keen to tackle as often as we possibly can. But over and above that, ensuring through Welsh Government funding, which is potentially available after the Dame Carol Black review into drug strategy, etc., for the British government, making sure that we're able to offer a route out of addiction for those that are using drugs as well, because we can criminalise them continuously. But I think ideally, if we can stop them taking drugs in the first place, they get better. But more importantly, our public are then subject to less crimes such as theft to help fund others' habits. So a simple statistic, if it helps those that are watching this evening to be reassured that drug dealing is something that we're keen on tackling. We've doubled the number of stop searches over the course of the last couple of weeks, and there's room to do that significantly more as well. It's not a tactic which we should use carte blanche everywhere. It must be intelligence-led, but I think there's much more that we can do to use that tactic and for the public to see that we do that as well. So the fact that it's doubled, I hope, is a reassurance to some.
Yeah, so I just wanted to perhaps there's a specific comment from Jez Williams in Ammanford about information that from that estate in relation to drug dealing. So there would be perhaps an expectation by the public that once that information is shared with the police, that some action will be taken. So I guess, it's important to reiterate the messages around, you talked about Crime Stoppers. I always mention Crime Stoppers as a way of providing information. I think it's 0800 555 111 is the number that you can ring for Crime Stoppers. You mentioned 101, but also going onto the website, we are trying increasingly to get people to, in quite a dynamic way, as we are using the technology this evening, to go onto the Dyfed-Powys Police website, click on the report button that is there to report some of that information. But I guess as the representative of the public, then the challenge back to you as operational staff and through you as the Chief Constable, Richard, would be, well, we've provided you with quite a lot of information about this drug dealing. Yes. What action is being taken? Why hasn't the warrant been executed? Can you explain a little bit about perhaps the layering of information and the amount of information that perhaps is required before, ultimately you can exercise some of that information then in the form of warrants and other activity?
Yes. So first of all, the question from Jez, before I come on to your specific point, Commissioner, if I may. Jez, 4 years is too long. So if there's a continuing problem within your community, I'd ask if you contact my office directly, I can make sure that I look into the details of your specific case. For the more general response, what I will say is when you report drug dealing in to Dyfed-Powys Police, it must be frustrating if you don't see an immediate response. If you don't see a police officer within your street within the next 10 minutes or within the next 10 hours even, it can be frustrating to think that nothing's done with that information. If we're going to swear a warrant out with a magistrate, it's important that we have a range of information or intelligence that we can share. We are less likely to be given a warrant to search a premises on one piece of information or intelligence, for example. So if it's Jez or somebody else who phones us and thinks nothing's happening, I can reassure you, first of all, it is happening, because we'll be gathering information on a particular property up until the point, and we have people dedicated to this role, by the way. This is not something which is ancillary to another task that somebody does, dedicated to drawing together enough intelligence to swear out a warrant. Now, our communities, when we swear out those warrants, we don't always do them at nice times of day, of course. They can be 4 o'clock in the morning, they can be 4 o'clock in the afternoon, because we take into consideration all sorts of movements of those that use and deal drugs. It might be that we've undertaken that task whilst you are away from your home. You might not even know that a warrant has been executed at a property in your area. I know our neighbourhood teams do a great job of leaflet dropping to say when we've done that. So probably we can do a little bit more of that to increase the awareness of it happening. But it can be a long period to draw enough information together to put somebody's dough in and execute a warrant. I've been really clear with the organisation since my return, and I know Claire Parmenter as the temporary chief was as well. We need to be proactive, and it is a rising tide for us in that regard as a prioritisation process.
So did you talk about being proactive? And one of the things that you've mentioned earlier, and I've seen the proof of this in some of the data that I analyse in terms of my role in scrutinising the force, is that increase in stop and search that you talked about. So how would you reassure the public that some of this additional stop and search activity isn't in effect knee-jerk or a one-off activity, because I guess you've arrived as a new chief constable in the force and you put the directive into it. We need to ensure it's proportionate and legitimate at the end of the day, and there's a rationale behind that. So how do you satisfy yourself that that is what's being done?
Yeah. So beyond satisfying myself regarding the stop search figures, which I'll come onto, we also have an independent scrutiny on that, to make sure that those sitting outside Dyfed-Powys offer some independent advice to us as to whether it's being proportionately used. And it's important the public know that that is done, and that it's not just us looking at our own figures. And I know, Commissioner, you do the same in a sort of scrutiny role as well. In terms of ensuring that we don't use the power disproportionately, there's a number of things that you can do. Perhaps the most important metric which we keep an eye on is the linked outcome rate or positive outcome rate. So if I use 100 stop searches as an example, because it's a nice round number, if we did 100 stop searches in the week before I turned up to be Chief Constable, and the number of them that were positive were 30%, that's a high number, by the way. That's way above the national average in terms of the number of stop searches which are positive, 30%. If it's 30% the week before I start, and I arrive, and we increase the number of stop searches to 500 a week, which we're nowhere near, by the way, I'm just using this for illustrative purposes. If the linked outcome rate remains at about 30%, that's good, because we know the power is still being used proportionately. So if on my arrival we do 500 stop searches and we only find drugs on 2 people, we can know that the power is being used disproportionately simply because I've asked for it to be used. So the most important metric is that that linked outcome rate remains as high as it has been and around about the national average at its very worst.
So we've got on to the topic of stop and search, and there's been a lot of national debate in relation to the use of stop and search. It is very often, I guess, framed from a perspective of metropolitan areas and the response to knife crime, and also the disproportionality in relation to the Black, Asian and minority ethnic population in terms of the stop and search figures. Some weeks ago, I think I saw from an article perspective, it was quite an inflammatory article, but there was some commentary in relation to the disproportionate representation of the Black, Asian and minority ethnic population in the Dyfed-Powys stop and search data. So again, what checks and balances are in place to reassure the public and for you to be certain that there isn't anything untoward here, terms such as institutionally racist being used, for example? But how would you explain that from your perspective as a chief officer?
So making sure our officers are trained in bias and that they understand their own biases, because we all have biases, of course, for all sorts of reasons. So making sure that that training is in place for our officers so they know what the power is, they know how to use it, and the impact that disproportionality can have on our Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. It's a real issue for the whole country, and it's an issue here in Dyfed-Powys as well in terms of disproportionality, of course. A problem with some of the data for me is that it is calculated on the basis of our resident Black, Asian and minority ethnic community, where a lot of the stop searches that we do, no matter what race people are actually people from outside our force area, because we think they're bringing potentially drugs into the force area. So it isn't always the best metric to measure the number of stop searches that you do against your resident population of Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities, because it's people from elsewhere, not always, of course, but elsewhere sometimes that we search on county lines operations, which are, of course, from outside of the force. There is weekly scrutiny on stop search that we give within the force as well. So there's an ongoing conversation about ensuring that we are not being disproportionate, or if we are, that we can justify that that search did result in the seizure of drugs, a firearm, a knife, etc. It tends to be drugs in this part of the world rather than knives and firearms, I'm pleased to say, but it's a matter of weekly conversation.
And I did happen to listen to the evidence you gave along with your other colleagues in Wales to the Welsh Affairs Select Committee this week in Westminster. You were invited to give evidence, and I know this was one of the questions that was asked in relation to stop and search and disproportionality. So I'm grateful that we've been able to discuss and for you to be able to highlight some of the challenges in relation to data, but also the way in which it is reviewed and scrutinised on a regular basis within the force. And,
yes.
And obviously, as the Commissioner, there's a role that I play in that as well. But one of the questions that was asked, and this was the where I said there was a bit controversial earlier, and then you came back into the room. I was talking about you behind your back, basically, yes, when you were off screen. But you were asked in that committee meeting in relation to the article. I think the original article was published on the 1st of March. Now, it might have been strategic on your part that on St David's Day you were asking questions in relation to the operational structure of policing in Wales, in relation to the notion of having one Welsh force. And I know people will have a different view in relation to this, but do you want to just explain a little bit in relation to that position that you have, and I guess the subsequent debate that they then follow from the comments that you've made?
So what I first want to do is deconflict two things. I hope what's obvious from my social media platform, I only use Twitter, I don't use other forums. I hope what's obvious to the people that know me and social media that I'm a proud Welshman. But that has nothing to do with my thoughts on this matter. They're entirely separate things, and it's important, I think, to say that it doesn't come, making this sort of declaration publicly, does not come from a romantic position of being a Welshman who wants an all-Wales police force. I make the point on the basis that operationally, I think we can be more effective as a single police force across Wales. It's happened very well in Scotland. There have been efficiencies that they've made which are north of £2 billion. We won't achieve those savings in Wales because we're smaller, of course. And we can plough that back in, not just to police officer numbers, but to police staff members who do a phenomenal job for us across Wales. And if you were to sweep away those boundaries, the ability, as they've seen in Scotland, to move specialist resources from one part of the country to the other in response to major incidents increases. It is not a universally accepted view, as you will know, and we've seen that in some of the media reaction this week. I don't take a public position on the devolution of policing powers because that is a purely political matter. But given that the 4 commissioners in Wales feel that the devolution of policing is something they want to see in Wales, so taking powers from Westminster for policing and the Home Office back to Cardiff Bay, I think we can best receive those powers if we are set up as a single police force. You will have one standard that we apply for the Welsh language. There will be one policy that we have in all areas of policing, which I think would make things easier. And the final point I make, we all collaborate brilliantly across Wales already, and therefore it feels to me like the natural next step, because we are already collaborating in a number of areas. And the relationships in Wales are great as well.
Thank you, Richard. And hopefully that's clarified a few positions, really, because, yes, as you rightly point out, it's not a universal view, and there have been some critics of some of the commentary that you've made public recently. I think it is also important, as you rightly did, to deconflict some of the operational comments that you make and then the political will for other things to happen, such as the devolution of policing, which some would argue is a natural step following both the Silk Commission and the Thomas Commission. Very recently, Lord Thomas of Comisiynydd presented a report in relation not just to policing. Policing was an element of it. It was on the wider context in relation to justice for Wales, and the growing body of Welsh law and the influence that the Welsh Senedd has had on public life in Wales and our communities is quite significant. So that will be a political discussion. But what you're talking and articulating is the opportunities for greater collaboration, ultimately moving to a single Welsh force. And
I make one additional point in relation?
Of course.
It was 2006 that the 4 chief constables, there are only 4 chiefs in Wales, of course, the 4 chief constables in Wales all said in evidence to the Welsh Assembly that there should be one police service for Wales. It was the late Terry Grange for Dyfed-Powys, Barbara Wilding in South Wales, Mike Tong in Gwent, and Richard Brunstrom in North Wales. So as the view that I take might seem radical in 2022, in 2006, all 4 chief constables publicly stated this position. So I'm not the first to say so, and I hope I'm not the last.
Okay, Richard, we might draw a line under it for now, because it is something that's been debated, and some might argue, and I'll say this in the, I guess, well, I hope you'll accept it in the way that it's received, I guess, is that some might argue that and perhaps we come back and argue against this point, really, but some might say that it's a distraction from the day-to-day activities of the force. So actually, as the Chief Constable of Dyfed-Powys should be concentrating on the operational delivery of the force that you were charged to lead, and not be sort of, I guess, pontificating about the future and what the future might hold.
That's a fair challenge. It's a very fair challenge. But I think the services here in Dyfed-Powys can be better delivered under that system, which is why I guess I make the point more publicly. But as we've debated already, it's not a position which is universally accepted. And the last point I would make, and it's subject to any other questions you may have, is that I've seen a number of chief constables nationally say things that they passionately believe the day they leave office, or very often the next day, an article in The Guardian, an article in the Times. And I feel if there's something that I believe to be true and there's to be an evidence base behind it, which some dispute, I think the responsibility on me as a leader in Wales is to say so publicly whilst I'm in a position to do something about it. So that was part of the drive for me, for saying something now as opposed to waiting until I have my slippers on and sort of retired from the job and not in a position to influence the debate.
Diolch, thank you, Richard. So it hasn't been the only reason Dyfed-Powys Police has been in the news this week. There was also a pretty a negative news story in the news last night in relation to Aberystwyth in particular, in relation to antisocial behaviour. So if we just perhaps bring it back down to the local level, how some of the challenges then that you face as the chief coming back to the force. How are you hoping to interact with those communities to make sure that some of those problems, and some of them may have been problems that have been around for some time. We had Jez earlier talking about 4 years in Amherst drug dealing. We've had
yes.
The commentary from Aberystwyth in the news last night. How are you going to respond to those community problems that are being brought to your attention?
Well, our neighbourhood policing provision, thanks to DCC Parliamentary at Dyfed-Powys, is amongst the best in the country and is regarded as being exceptionally good. So that is part of the operational response on a day-to-day basis. It won't be me that people see in Aberystwyth on a night shift, of course, it'll be the local officers. And frankly, they'll do a far better job than I would in dealing with antisocial behaviour in Aberystwyth and other places. But in terms of satisfying myself that things are as they should be, I've always been a chief constable, and beyond that as a deputy and in other ranks as well. But particularly as a chief constable, I've always been one who patrols a lot. I spend a lot of time with frontline officers and staff, talking to communities directly about their problems. And it was by no accident that on my first day back at Dyfed-Powys, I took over on the Sunday. It had been the 11th or 12th of December, I forget what date it was specifically. On the Saturday night before, I worked a full night shift. And I worked it out with frontline officers. And coincidentally, it was in Aberystwyth because that's where I started as a young PC. So for those who are with us this evening from Aberystwyth, it is a town which is close to my heart. I understand that there are some concerns around whether it's criminality or antisocial behaviour in the town. But I know our neighbourhood policing officers and staff are working day and night to resolve those. I will be spending more time in Aberystwyth over the days and weeks to come to ensure, of course, that I satisfy myself that response is as it should be. But again, it is about ensuring that the community contact us as often as they can when they do have problems, and not to stop doing that. Because only when we have a full picture about what's happening in a town can we respond appropriately. So I'm not going to repeat what's been said by I think it's a Nico Craig online, but I think he disagrees, Richard, with the neighbour policing team description. I think he's used another word, and it might be worthwhile reminding people that if you're not happy with the service that's been provided, there is an opportunity to complain, and the complaints process has changed in recent years, where policing more generally is trying to turn it into an experience where there's more learning and there's more open dialogue in relation to complaints against the police force. And if you again go onto the website, there's an opportunity to complain in relation to the particular incident you feel you haven't been provided with that service. But is that something that, I appreciate that you've only been back for just over 3 months, Richard, but are you getting a sense that the communities of Dyfed-Powys are supportive of the force generally? What is your current feel in relation to that relationship with the public, and what is your vision for the future in relation to that relationship? So there is a drive, understandably, towards making sure that people report things online. I think that's an important thing, because it means that we shift our demand elsewhere and can deal with it more efficiently. But part of, as you will recall, I'm sure, part of some of the things that I said in my pitch to return to Dyfed-Powys in interview was to make sure that we are accessible to our rural communities. And that means ensuring that our buildings are accessible, that there is a blue light on in some of those towns that perhaps haven't had a blue light on for some time, and that we are out and about on a regular basis. I think that is something further that we can offer, not just through our neighbourhood policing teams, but all of the police officers and staff who have right across the force as well. Some of our estate is ageing. It is right across the United Kingdom. So what I would like to see over the years to come, and of course we've already started discussing this in broad terms internally in the organisation, is how can we update the provision that we've got to be more innovative, a shop front type situation, perhaps more than a closed police station, and to do so in conjunction with our partners as well. If we are looking to build a new police station somewhere or to refurbish somewhere, it's very likely that the health sector, the local authority or the fire and rescue service are looking to do exactly the same. So I can see us interacting a lot more, and those that are online from Powys tonight will know, of course, Llandrindod Wells and how well that joint venture works between the courts, us and Mid and Wales Fire and Rescue Service. So the provision I'd like to see over the years to come is that we become an even more accessible force than we already are. And just in conclusion of that answer, if I may, and this is a good thing, without a shadow of doubt it's a good thing, Dyfed-Powys' communities demand high standards of us. And I never want that to stop. I never want them to stop telling us that we could do better. And it drives us to improve, because we do read the comments that come in from the public as senior leaders. We'll be discussing some of those things, as you know, at an event tomorrow. So I would urge our community to keep holding us to account, which is part of your role, of course, Commissioner, on providing the best services we possibly can.
Yeah, indeed. And I would echo that and be encouraging people to communicate with my office as well. So it's been a difficult time, and we haven't spoken about COVID. And I know when we did previous commissioning conversation sessions, there was a lot of in the context of COVID, and we haven't spoken about COVID because we're in the we're in the throes of moving to a different state of sort of new normal, as is described, and coming out of COVID. I'm not saying that we're out of the COVID sort of woods yet, because obviously we're seeing the infection rate going up in our communities, but certainly in terms of interaction with the public, we're getting back to what might be described as more normal way of working. And I would encourage, and that's true for my office, just this week I've been out in Llanelli, next week I'm in Aberystwyth and down to Neyland, and the following week going on other visits across the force area. So we're starting to interact more in that way. So there's always an opportunity for people to communicate with my office as the Police and Crime Commissioner as well. There's a message that's been posted as well from Ali, and talks about whether the force would be inclined to hold an open day or a family fun day so that people can have access to police headquarters. I think it's something that we've done, well, I know it's something we've done in the past, something that we held pre-COVID about sort of 3 or 4 years ago. So is that something that's on your radar at the moment, Richard?
Yeah, I mean, COVID has meant that we've ceased all sorts of activities that we would have normally done before, of course. And I remember the last family day we had at police headquarters, it poured down, which meant that, of course, a lot of the services and interactions we're having were internal within the building, which doesn't have the same feel about it. Now, we can't legislate for the weather, but as a young child, I do remember coming to some of those days at police headquarters as well, where there's an opportunity to see how forensics work, because that's something, if you pardon the pun, I want to shine more of a light on as well. The opportunities there are for members of the public to work at Dyfed-Powys, but not wearing uniform like I do. We have police staff members doing professional roles, which are incredibly important. So the fun day, Ali, you're absolutely right. People come to pat the dogs. They want to see the Springer Spaniels. They want to see the nastier dogs bite some of our police officers with big sleeves on, and to sort of do those things around policing, which draw people in, the helicopters, etc., the fast cars that some of our officers drive. But to use it as a vehicle to bring people into our force, to think about us as an employer, but not everybody as a police officer. They're a vital part of what we do, but there are so many specialist skills and scientists that we have working in a place like Dyfed-Powys that it's an opportunity to do so. So, Ali, I hadn't thought about doing it over the next few months, and it does take some planning to do, but perhaps next summer that's something we can look at. Good idea.
And linked to that, Richard, you talked about recruitment, and I guess it's important for us to ensure that we've got a wide diversity of recruitment, and we're targeting not just diversity in relation to the population, but also in diversity in terms of skills. I'm aware that we today interacted with one of the universities here in Wales to try and ensure that we attract the best possible talent into the force to deal with the challenges of a 21st century policing service. So how is that changing, and how do you see that changing in the future?
We've always valued our police staff members, but I think there's more that we can do in that regard. So traditionally, like any job perhaps, what we've done is when we have a vacancy, we advertise that externally, which is what we should be doing wherever we possibly can, and situations as they dictate. But when that happens, we've waited to see who's applied. We've had some phenomenal staff members apply as a result of that. But in terms of the interaction with the university, and I should say, not everybody that works for us needs a degree, far from it. Some of the best police officers and police staff members I've ever worked with did not have degrees. But for those jobs that do require that, data scientists, forensics and others, we are now doing a lot more to interact directly with the best universities in Wales. First of all, we don't want talented young people who live in Wales, whether they're Welsh or not, talented young people who live in Wales, brain draining to other parts of the country. We want to retain them in our communities in West Wales. And so we are interacting directly with our universities and asking them, like we started to do today, tell us who your 4 brightest students are in a particular class on the subject matter that we might be interested in, and just get us in a room with them. Now, we can't offer jobs in that way, nor should we, but we can certainly start proactively looking for the best talent in Mid and West Wales. If you're a young person living in Mid and West Wales and thinking about going off to university or not, I'd encourage you to think about us as an employer beyond the people that wear a uniform.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Totally agree. Diolch, Richard. Thank you. Now, so I mentioned at the sort of in the middle of our conversation that we're both first language Welsh speakers, and we've been talking for over 40 minutes now, It's a bit strange, actually, if I'm honest, in this sort of public forum. We're live on social media channels for us to be speaking English to one another, because we converse through the medium of Welsh. And in fact, during our celebration of the Welsh language in force, and we hold Mawrth Mawr as an event, St David's Day, and then obviously through the month of March we celebrate the Welsh language. We conducted our main governance meeting, which is the policing board meeting, through the medium of Welsh. So I wonder whether we can, I guess, end the conversation for the next sort of 10 or 15 minutes talking in Welsh. Allwn ni droi y sgwrs nawr, siarad Cymraeg. I ryw raddau, mae hwnna'n teimlo tyma bach. Mae'n teimlo chydig yn llai ffurfiol hefyd.
Ydy, mae e.
Mae'n gyfle falle ni just siarad eto ynglyn â'r sialensau a'r hyn I ti'n delio da fel Prif Gwnstabl. Yn amlwg ti wedi sôn am beth rhai o'r rhesymau ddys di nôl I Gymru, ffaith bod ti'n Gymro balch ag ati. Fel mae'r iaith yn gweddi mewn I dy waith fel Prif Gwnstabl, wyt ti'n meddwl bod yr iaith yn bwysig er enghraifft i'r llu?
Mae'n canolog i'n gwaith ni, a fel ti'n gweud, mae ddim yn naturiol iawn I siarad Saesneg gyda ti, achos Cymraeg ni wedi siarad eriod gyda'n gilydd. Nes I ysgrifennu blog llynedd ar Mawrth y cyntaf hefyd, ar pwysigrwydd yr iaith Gymraeg, a nes I ysgrifennu hwnna ar sail fel rhywun oedd yn gweithio tu allan I Gymru ar y pryd yn Lloegr. Cymro estron yw'r Cymro orau, maen nhw'n gweud, a mae persbectif, mae pellter daearyddol yn gallu cael ar beth mae bywyd fel yng Nghymru. Gollwn ni aelod yn teulu tu ar amser nes I adael ardal Dyfed-Powys I fynd lan i'r gogledd, a fe ddath parchedig Emlyn Dôl i'r tŷ I fod gyda'r teulu cyn yr angladd. Nawr, trwy gyfrwng y Gymraeg gath y wasanaeth byrna I ddal, oedd e'n holl pwysig mewn amser o galar, neu mewn amser trist, neu hapus, bod pobl yn gallu cyfarthrebu yn I mamiaeth. Bydde fe wedi bod yn brofiad hollol wahanol os bydde hynny wedi cael ei wneud trwy gyfrwng y Saesneg. Ac mae'r un peth i'n gwaith ni yn Heddlu Dyfed-Powys, dwi'n credu. I ni'n troi at y Saesneg yn aml, achos mae pawb yn siarad Saesneg yn hardal ni, wrth gwrs, a maen nhw'n teimlo felly bod nhw'n gwneud cymwynas yn ni wrth wneud hynny, yn hytrach na mynnu ar gwasanaeth trwy gyfrwng yr iaith Gymraeg. Dwi eisiau clywed aelodau'n cymunedau yn mynnu cael gwasanaeth trwy gyfrwng y Gymraeg yn mwy aml. I ni'n gallu darparu'r gallu hynny, a nid dim ond, wrth gwrs, mewn â siaradwyr Cymraeg i Dyfed-Powys sydd angen wneud. I ni'n gweld mae'r gweithlu sydd gyda ni yn barod iawn i ddysgu'r iaith. I ni'n cynnig gwersi mewnol, wrth gwrs. Ac felly mae'r iaith yn holl bwysig, nid yn unig i'r lle gwaith i ni, ond yn y mywyd hefyd.
Wrth gwrs, a i fi, fel Comisiynydd, wrth gwrs, mae'n braf clywed yr hyn i ti'n sôn ynglyn â pwysigrwydd yr iaith i'r llu a'r wasanaeth i ni'n rhoi i'r gymuned. Ond yn bellach na ni hefyd yn gweld y continuum nawr sydd wedi bod o addysg Gymraeg cynradd, trwyddo i addysg Gymraeg uwchradd, a fi'n credu bod y ddoi o ni yn unigolion sydd wedi bod trwy'r addysg uwchradd Cymraeg hynny, os fi'n cofio'n iawn. Yn meddwl bod ti wedi bod yn ddisgybl yn ysgol Ystradau yn Llanelli, o'n hoff. Gywir, ie, iawn, fi wedi gwneud yng ngwaith gartre. A fynnen yn gyn ddisgybl ysgol Dyffryn Teifi, sy'n nawr yn ysgol Bro Teifi yn Llandysul. A ni nawr yn gweld y Coleg Cymraeg, a nifer o'r prifysgolion yn gallu darparu cyrsiau graddedig, lefel graddedig trwy gyfrwng y Gymraeg, wneud modiwlau trwy gyfrwng y Gymraeg. Felly, yr cam nesaf wedyn yw sicrhau bod y gweithlu, enghraifft Dyfed-Powys, ond yn meysydd eraill hefyd, yn rhoi cyfleon i unigolion i medru a defnyddio'r iaith mewn lle proffesiynol, ond hefyd yn ehangach na hynny, falle, fel nathon ni profi yn mis Mawrth, mae yna gyfleon falle i ni gweithredu yn fewnol trwy'r iaith Gymraeg hefyd yn broffesiynol, achos mae hwnna falle yn rhywbeth yn y gorffennol mae pobl wedi gweld yn anodd oherwydd falle, fi'n defnyddio y term Saesneg, logistics, ynddo fe, y peth. Fel i ni'n gweithredu hynny fewnol gan ystyried, dyw pawb o fewn y gweithlu ddim yn medru ar yr iaith, a mae rhaid ni sicrhau bod pawb yn teimlo bod nhw'n rhan o'r broses llywodraethiant fewnol, governance mewnol, rheoli mewnol, a falle bod yna waith i wneud, achos wrth gwrs, dwi wedi bod yn Comisiynydd ers bron 6 mlynedd, a mae un cyfarfod mewnol llywodraethiant i fi wedi cynnal trwy gyfrwng y Gymraeg. Hynny yw, mae yna waith i wneud yn gysau.
Oes. Mae'r gwaith hynny'n bwysig, a ti'n iawn, ti wedi gweud yn barod mewn ffordd, mae'n bwysig bod ni ddim yn ynysu rheina sydd yn gweithio yn Dyfed-Powys, sydd ddim yn siarad Cymraeg, sydd yn ddi-Gymraeg. Maen nhw hefyd yn deall pwysigrwydd yr iaith, a mae hynny'n ddigon yn bell waith. Beth sydd wedi bod yn gret, beth dwi wedi gweld yn fwy ar ôl dod nôl yw, mae pobl yn fwy parod nawr i o leia dechrau a gorffen cyfarfod trwy gyfrwng y Gymraeg. So ni'n dechrau gyda bore da, mae'n braf i weld chi gyd heddi, ac wedyn yn troi'r Saesneg. Ac felly yn araf bach, i ni'n gweld bod defnydd yr iaith yn cael ei gynyddu yn fewnol. Does dim eisiau gwneud yn gyson, achos mae'n bwysig bod pobl ddim yn cael ei ynysu. Ond yn slow fach yn newid y diwylliant hynny i sicrhau bod siarad Cymraeg yn y lle gwaith, wel, yr un peth a bod ni'n siarad gydreg yn teuluoedd.
Ie, dwi'n cytuno. Nawr, mae'r flwyddyn hon yn mynd i fod yn flwyddyn ble fi'n credu ni'n gobeithio fyddwn ni'n gallu, fel o'n i'n sôn yn gynt, fi'n gallu mynd nôl i rhywfaint o normalrwydd ynglyn â digwyddiadau. A wrth gwrs mae yna digwyddiadau enfawr yn digwydd o fewn y llu yn ystod y flwyddyn. Mae gyda ni'r sioe frenhinol sydd yn achlysur arbennig, a wrth gwrs dyw e ddim wedi bod yn cwrdd. Fi'n credu oedd y sioe eiaf llynedd, ond ddim fel i ni wedi cael yn gorffennol. Felly mae'r sioe mynd i fod ymlaen eleni, a hefyd yr Eisteddfod yn Tregaron. Felly mae yna gyfleon eiraidd i'r llu ymgysylltu'r gymuned yn y digwyddiadau mawr yma. Mae sioe Sir Benfro. Mae fi'n ofalus nawr, beth dwi'n enwi, achos byddai'n pechu rhyw ardal o'r llu.
Mae sgalet yn wario dy sadwn.
Trwy peidio sôn am ryw ddigwyddiad. Ond mae yna nifer o ddigwyddiadau, a di'r llu yn mynd i ddefnyddio'r cyfleon hynny ymgysylltu da'r gymuned?
Yn sicr, a mi fach bod ti wedi enwi'r 3 na'n benodol, sioe Sir Benfro, y sioe Llanelwydd, wrth gwrs, a'r Eisteddfod yn Tregaron yn hwyrach eleni. Mae'r 3 peth na mynd i fod yn fwy llwm achos diw Dau Jones Llanylar ddim gyda ni rhagor wrth gwrs, a bydde fe wedi bod yn rhan blaenllaw yn y tri peth na, dwi'n siŵr, yn ywedig felly yn y Tregaron ac yn Llanelwydd hefyd, gan bod wedi bod yn lywydd ar y sioe yn y gorffennol. Byddwn ni yno bob dydd yn y tri sioe hynny, ac wrth gwrs mewn llefydd eraill yn y Gelli, sef Heion Wai, yn yr wyl lyfrau sydd gyda nhw fyna. Mae'n bwysig bod ni ddim yn eistedd, a ni ddim yn, bod ni ddim yn eistedd yn ein gorsafwydd yn aros i pobl i ddod ato ni. Mae'n bwysig bod pobl yn gweld ni yn yr ardaloedd le maen nhw'n mynd. Mae tua 250,000 o bobl yn mynd i Llanelwydd bob blwyddyn, dwi'n credu. Wel, mae hwnna'n gyfle eiraidd i fynd i siarad gyda bobl am y problemau cefn gwlad sydd gennyn nhw. Ac felly byddwn ni yno yn lli mewn niferoedd mawr dros y misoedd nesaf. Dwi'n edrych mlaen i fod yn bersonol hefyd. Byddai yn pob un o'r tri na, dwi'n sicr.
Gwych. Iawn. Richard, mae bron yn awr fi'n credu. Mae'r cloc ar yn sgrin i'n gweud bod dros rhyw 50 munud. Ymddeiriadau i pawb bod fi wedi gorfod siarad yn hunan am rhyw 5 munud ar y dechrau am y problemau technegol. So, apologies to everybody that I had to speak for about 5 minutes on my own online, but that's technology for you. But it's been, I hope, an interesting discussion and debate and conversation, as is described with you, Richard, as the new chief now in Dyfed-Powys. I'm not sure how long I can get away with calling you, because you've been the chief now since mid-December, and we're already gone 3 months into your tenure as the Chief Constable. Ond fi'n diolchgar iawn I ti am bod yn barod I cael y sgwrsiau yma ar y fforymau yma sydd yn chydig yn wahanol. Mae'n gyfle I ni gobeithio lledaenu'r neges a cael cyfleon I ymgysylltu gyda pobl mewn ffyrdd gwahanol. It's perhaps a more innovative way of engaging with the community and the public, giving them an opportunity to make comment. Some good, bad, indifferent, I'm sure will be posted. Apologies that we haven't been able to take all of the comments and all of the items. There may have been 1 or 2 specific questions asked in relation to a specific area, and it's difficult in this type of forum to make an immediate sort of comment in relation to some of those. But I'm very, very grateful on a personal level that you have interacted with both Richard and myself. A just gair o ddiolch I ti, Richard. Os rhywbeth ti'n moyn gweud ar y diwedd, is there something you want to say at the end of this conversation as we come to a close?
Only how proud I am to serve in any capacity in our communities here in Mid and West Wales. Dyfed-Powys is an extraordinary organisation, and the pride I feel simply for wearing that same uniform as many of my colleagues do is extraordinary. And to thank you for the privilege of returning as the Chief Constable as well. And I can promise all of our audience members this evening that I'll work hard to make sure that this remains one of the safest places to live in England and Wales.
Gwych iawn. Diolch yn fawr iawn I ti, Richard. Thank you very much to everybody who's interacted, those of you who have taken the time to listen to this broadcast. And I hope that in the future you'll tune in again when we have other guests in the Commissioner conversation in the future. Diolch yn fawr iawn I chi gyd. Thank you all for tuning in. Diolch.